It is now Wednesday, October 21st, and I'm afraid I still have technology on my mind. Technology just all over my mind right now. I spent a fair amount of time yesterday afternoon, last night, and again this morning, lost in the world of the internet, reviewing tablets, smartphones, and all of the technology that entails. And of course, that can only take you so far. I think at some point you have to stop looking at reviews and you have to actually go out into stores and hold things in your hands. You'd think you could just figure everything out from the data, but it's surprising how much you can learn from like physically seeing something, whether you like it or not, or what something means. I remember going through this when I was looking into cameras, and I would come across some camera that everybody was raving about, particularly for vlogging or for YouTube, and I would be consumed with thoughts of this camera, and then I would finally go out to a camera store thinking, wow, this is the most amazing camera I've ever heard about. And then I'd walk into the camera store and then pick it up, and within 2 seconds of picking it up, it's like, oh, poof, oh, I can't use this. It's too heavy, too big. And somehow things like too heavy and too big doesn't really come across when you're reading reviews. You can see how many pounds and ounces and kilograms and grams something weighs, but it's not until you go into a camera store and pick it up you realize what you're really talking about. So at some point you've got to shut down your internet browser and go out into the real world, and that's what I'm going to do today. Nothing major. I just want to walk down the main street here in Mae Sot. I know there's a few smartphone shops, and I'm just going to walk in and look up and down the rows and just sort of get a sense of what these phones look like and what's on the market. Who knows what I'll end up figuring out. Here's where my head is at with technology in general. My thinking is that eventually I'm going to buy a laptop. I don't know when, but I will. But I think I'm also going to buy a new smartphone anyway, because it's time to upgrade. So I think I'm going to take that as my starting point. I'm just going to buy a new smartphone here in Mae Sot and go from there. So I'm thinking, put the laptop ideas on hold, pick up a new smartphone, one that is useful for editing video and will solve a lot of my other tech problems, which I'll get into in a minute. And yeah, just go with that for now. Let me break down my history with phones and smartphones in general. For years and years and years in Taipei, all I had was one of those Nokia candy bar phones. It was good enough for me. I could send text messages, and if I absolutely needed to, I could make a phone call. I almost never did because I don't like talking on a smartphone. I can't, or on any phone. I can't understand what people are saying. So for me, it was a text messaging device. That's all I used it for. And when I left Taiwan and I went to the Philippines and then Indonesia, then Malaysia, then eventually here, I had the same thing. I just had that Nokia candy bar phone. That's what I was traveling with. And I'd never had a smartphone. I knew people in Taipei who bought smartphones. They were starting to come out. They were getting popular. Tablets were getting popular. But for whatever reason, I didn't see the need for one. And Also, getting one required, it seemed to require signing up for a phone plan with a company. And at that time, I just had my Nokia through a SIM card that I picked up at 7-Eleven. And then I would just recharge it at 7-Eleven and away I'd go. And it just seemed perfect. And I didn't even know how to, and I didn't want to sign up for a monthly contract and get a smartphone. And it was all just way too complicated for me. And I just didn't think I needed it. But eventually, over time, I saw the need for one. And I bought my first smartphone in Kuala Lumpur, actually not that long ago. It was a Samsung Galaxy J. I like the bigger phones because I like a big screen. And I bought the Galaxy J. I was super excited about it. I had no idea about all the things that a smartphone could do. It was like a major eye-opening experience for me. And then I went to Indonesia and somebody stole it. So I lost that phone very quickly. It was a guy on a motorbike. Funny story. I was a total nerd, I guess, total geek, because I had my phone in a little pouch on my belt. And I would normally put it away in my knapsack or somewhere. I was riding my bicycle at the time. I was bike touring. And I would put my phone away in the handlebar bag or someplace like that. But I had just been to immigration, and at immigration to renew my visa, I had to do all kinds of things with my phone, you know, to get information from it, to look up phone numbers and addresses and all these things. So rather than putting the phone away all the time, I clipped the case to my belt, and I left it there after I left immigration, and I was riding my bike down the main road in this town in Sumatra, and the phone was sitting here on my waist. And in the rear view mirror of my bicycle, I saw a guy on a motorcycle directly behind me. I mean, he was pacing me. I was riding my bike, and he was right behind me, going slowly on his motorcycle. And I didn't think anything of it because as I ride my bike, people come up beside me on motorbikes all the time because they want to chat, they want to talk, they want me to stop, and then we take a selfie together, and then they drive away. This happens all the time. So I saw the guy on the motorcycle, and I figured, oh, he's just being friendly, and he probably wants to talk to me. And eventually, this guy did come out from behind me, and then he started driving right beside me. And I looked over at him, and he looked at me, and then I just kind of, you know, waved and smiled, and I expected him to say hello and say something in English. But before I knew it, he had reached over, grabbed the pouch off my belt, and it wasn't firmly attached, so he just pulled it off my belt, hit the accelerator, and he was gone. And that was the last I saw of my fancy for me, Samsung Galaxy J smartphone. So I became quite a celebrity in that town for a while because I went to the police station and I filed a theft report. And there were some reporters there. I didn't know they were journalists. They didn't look like journalists and didn't introduce themselves as such. They're just a bunch of guys there hanging around at the police station, and they started talking to me, and I just told them my story. Next thing I knew, my story was all over the internet and all over the local papers. I had no idea they were journalists, but they were actually not just interested in my story. They were journalists, and they were reporting a theft of a phone from a foreigner, and that story ended up all over the place in Sumatra. So that was kind of funny. So that was my starting point in terms of smartphones. So there I was in Sumatra, no smartphone, and I wasn't that comfortable there, spending a lot of money to buy a replacement expensive phone. So I just went to a local store and I bought the cheapest smartphone I could find. like a bare budget, basic phone. And I thought that would just tide me over. And then I could eventually buy a new phone when I got back to Kuala Lumpur, where I was more comfortable shopping in all the electronic stores. And that was an interesting decision to make. I learned a lot from that because I do often think, why not just buy the cheapest one? Why buy even a mid-range phone? Certainly don't buy a high-end phone. I'm not a high-end kind of guy, I'm a mid-ranger. But you often think, why don't I just buy the cheapest model available and save some money? Well, I learned very quickly with this smartphone why you don't do that, depending on your needs, of course. But in my case, I bought this cheap phone, and I forget the brand name. It's a well-known brand, and it was a good phone. You know, even for the amount of money I spent, it's amazing you could get that much for that cheap a price. Looked great. It was a beautiful blue cover on it. I mean, it was a nice looking phone, but the battery would barely last from breakfast to lunch, and that was a huge problem. The camera itself was terrible, and that wasn't a big deal to me because I would take pictures with a real camera at the time. I didn't use my phone for a lot of photography, so it didn't bother me that the camera was mediocre. But the real problem was the screen, because I mainly wanted to use it for Google Maps when I'm out walking around in another city, and I would take the phone out in the daylight to look at Google Maps, and I just couldn't see anything on the phone screen. The LCD just was not bright enough, not enough color, not enough clarity, not enough contrast. I could not see anything on the phone. Even going into the shade, you end up having to go into a pitch black room and cover your eyes like this and in order to see anything. So that made it kind of useless to me, and I learned why you don't buy the cheapest phone. So I went back to Malaysia, back to Kuala Lumpur. This was the time when I had to get a new visa to return to Indonesia. And I thought, while I'm in Kuala Lumpur, I'll go out shopping and buy a new phone. And I kind of got lost in the weeds doing internet research. I had a set idea of the features I wanted in a certain phone, and all the phones I looked at always failed on one feature or another. And there were probably a million options out there for me had I been smarter. But I ended up obsessed with this idea of getting this phone, which is a Motorola. This is the Motorola Moto X Play. And I don't remember what year it came out. I'm sure it's probably 5-6 years ago now. I mean, it's not a new phone, which is why I'm running into problems with it. And this was also kind of an interesting lesson for me, because I do find I always seem to be looking for the one thing that nobody else does. Because even though I thought this Motorola and Motorola's in general were the right phone for me, they're not officially available in Malaysia. They weren't at that time anyway. You couldn't buy Motorola's anywhere. Nobody even knew what a Motorola was. And there I was, of course, out there in the markets and in the streets and in the stores looking for a Motorola phone, and nobody had any idea what I was talking about. And what I should have done, of course, was just give it up. Just buy what's available locally. Just do what everyone else around you is doing. But I always seem to be wanting to do the one thing that nobody else wants to do. And in this case, what I wanted to do was buy a Motorola Moto X Play. And I eventually found one. I had to go to this online seller who I think operated as kind of a gray market. It's a big company in Kuala Lumpur, so it's legit. It's not illegal or anything, but they do deal in gray market phones. And when you buy one, that means it does not come with all the extras. There's no warranty, for example, certainly no international warranty or anything like that. But I thought I would take the chance, and this was my main phone for a long time. But then I started thinking, overthinking perhaps, and my idea was, well, I had that phone, the Galaxy J7, and I used it for everything. It was just jammed with sensitive personal information. Losing your phone is not just like losing a Walkman or something, or an iPod, you're losing something that has access to your bank accounts, to your email. You lose that phone, and you are spending the next 3 days changing passwords on everything in your life and worrying constantly about security. It's a big deal to lose a phone from the security point of view. So I started thinking, is it wise to have such an important device, and then I'm out in the market on these crowded streets using it like a map? Because that was my number one usage, was Google Maps. That's all I use the phones for, to be honest. And it just seemed risky. I had it out in my hand all the time, looking at Google Maps. Then you've got that vision. You're not seeing people coming in because you're so focused on your phone. There's a real risk of that phone being stolen. So my idea, and I kind of got the idea from Indonesians, because most of the Indonesians around me, they would have 3 or even 4 phones. You would see them go into a local coffee shop or a restaurant, reach into their pocket, and they would take out 4 phones and stack them on in front of them like a deck of cards. And they would do this because one phone might be the company phone, one phone would be their personal smartphone, another phone would be a simple, candy bar phone, because they could get a very cheap plan for that phone for calls and texting that they couldn't get for their smartphone. And then they would have another phone, which was an old one that they still had. So they'd have like 4 phones. So I started thinking, yeah, it's not such a bad idea to have more than one phone. And I eventually found myself at another shop in Kuala Lumpur, and I bought a second phone. And the idea was to have one phone as my important device for banking, booking airline tickets, booking hotels, whatever I need to do. And this phone I would keep secure. I would keep it in my bag all the time, in my hotel room. I wouldn't even take it outside. I'd lock it up. I would do everything I could to keep this secure. And then I would take this phone, and this is the one I would take out into the real world and use it just for Google Maps. And then if this phone gets stolen, okay, it's bad. I've lost $200 or whatever I paid for the phone, but at least I'm not worried about my bank accounts. I'm not worried about security. It's just a tool that I use for Google Maps and for taking pictures. So if I lose it, I lose money, but I don't lose anything else. So that's how I became a 2-phone guy. I'm a 2-fisted phone operator these days. I'm still a huge fan of the 2-phone system. It's one of the smarter decisions I've ever made. There's so many advantages to it. One of them, for example, which I didn't think about when I bought the second phone, is that you now have 2 fully charged phones at all times. So you're using one phone and then the battery goes dead, rather than having to plug in that phone and wait hours for it to charge up. All you do is put that phone away and you take out your other phone, and now it's fully charged. It's sort of like having a power bank for your original phone. I just liked having 2 phones. They're both charged up. You can get 2 SIM cards using 2 different companies, because in certain countries, one company is good for one thing, another company is good for another. They're just all these random advantages. However, I did find out that my original idea of having a second phone for security, it actually doesn't work. And that's because of human nature. It would only work if you were incredibly disciplined and you kept that phone completely stripped down and you never added any extra programs to it. But over time, you start to slip. For one thing, if you just run Google Maps ordinarily and you don't sign in with your Google account, you run into all kinds of issues and problems, information that you don't have access to, things that don't work. So you kind of like, well, I'll sign up with my Google account on this phone. I think maybe you even have to. I'm not sure about that. And then you're out there wandering around with just your Google Maps phone, and your good phone is locked away safely in your hotel room. But now you find you actually kind of need to send an email or access an email or do something else. You need information, you need to do this, and you're out miles away from your email phone. And then eventually you can't help it. You take your second phone and you log into your regular email accounts. You log into your banks. You eventually end up with two twin phones. Each phone is running every program that you use and that you need. It's just human nature. So from a security point of view, having two phones didn't really work out the way I thought it would. But I have found it very, very handy in many, many other ways. So yeah, I'm glad to have two phones. And if I buy a new phone here in Mae Sot, I might end up with three phones. You never know. When I set out on this walk today, I didn't intend to tell any of those stories. That wasn't what I was going to talk about at all. All I really wanted to talk about was what are the problems with my current phones and why I want to buy a new one. Anyway, I'll start with the Motorola, my Moto X Play, which I've loved from the day I bought it. It's been a great phone for me. However, quite a long time ago now, I was in Kuala Lumpur and I decided to try shooting video with this phone. Tons of people were shooting YouTube videos with phones and it seemed really convenient and really interesting, and so I thought I would do that, and I got all set up with the phone mounted on a little tripod, and I was out walking around, going to some tourist attractions in Kuala Lumpur and shooting video with my smartphone. And right in the middle of doing that, it blew up. I guess, I still have no real idea. I guess the phone overheated because it really wasn't designed to be running video recording for that long without a break. And I guess it just got hotter and hotter and hotter, and then something in the phone fried and it shut down and it wouldn't turn on. Nothing I could do to get the phone to turn on again. I thought I had bricked it entirely. But then, oddly enough, a couple of days later or something, I was trying again. I was doing one of those, just holding down the power button for 20 seconds to get it to reboot. And then the phone did turn on, but it had wiped my entire phone clean. Everything was gone. When it shut down from overheating, something fried and I lost everything. So it was basically like a factory reset. And on top of that, it's never quite worked properly since then. Weird things happen all the time. It's never been quite the same phone that it was, especially when it comes to shooting video or doing anything really. And then finally, the battery started to go. So it doesn't really hold a battery charge anymore. I can get, an hour out of it or something like that if I'm lucky. And I looked into replacing the battery, getting a new battery for it. But I've gone down that road before with devices, an older device, and you go to replace the battery. And by the time you're done spending all that money on buying a new battery, figuring out where you can buy the thing to begin with, and then somehow figuring out how to open up your device and replace the battery, chances are you're going to break the device, which I've done in the past. But then even if you manage to do it successfully, you spend a lot of money for a 5-year-old phone. And you might as well have just put that money towards getting a new phone. So that's my feeling about the Motorola. There's no point replacing the battery, and I might as well replace it with a new phone. I forgot one problem with the Motorola. It's actually the biggest problem. All the other ones I can kind of work around. But the main problem is memory. This phone being an older one, in terms of internal memory, like internal storage, it only has 16 gigabytes of internal storage. And that really isn't enough for a modern phone to be running all the apps I need to run. And that's another side to phones that I find endlessly confusing, because I did run into this memory limitation only recently as I've started doing more and more things with my phone. And yet, when I do the math, it doesn't make sense that the memory is full, because you download all these programs like storage analyzers that tell you what files are occupying all the memory, and it helps you clear up memory and clear caches and hidden files and all these things. But whenever I look into all these programs and I do the math, I add up the size of all the files that are stored in memory, and it doesn't even come close to 16 gigabytes, like nowhere even near. And even assuming there's another 5 gigabytes of other stuff like system files and whatnot, it still doesn't make any sense. So I cannot figure out what is using up these 16 gigabytes of memory. It's really hard to figure out. It's not like a computer where you can just sort of open up, File Explorer and see all of the files, and then it all adds up neatly. On a phone, I add up all the files on my phone, and I should have like 5 gigabytes of files on that phone. Why do I have 16? Where are the other 11 gigabytes coming from? I cannot figure it out. But it's time to just give up on that, because these days, even the Samsung Galaxy A31, which I've been looking at, it comes with standard 64 gigabytes of memory. Add a little bit to the purchasing price, and you're looking at 128 gigabytes of memory. So if I buy a new phone, I'll be going from 16 gigabytes, which is pretty much unworkable, up to 128 gigabytes. And I'm very much looking forward to doing that. I just realized I never mentioned what my second phone is. And it's an interesting phone as well. This one is the Xiaomi Redmi 4 Prime. And buying this one, when I bought it, was also a little bit of an experiment, because I kept hearing from people about this brand, Chinese brand Xiaomi, and the main selling point was that they were incredible value, that you could spend X amount of money on a Samsung and you're going to get a plastic body and all these sorts of things. And then if you spend that exact same amount of money on a Xiaomi, you're getting much more. You're getting a more powerful processor, you're getting Gorilla Glass, you're getting metal construction, you're getting more memory. So for an equivalent amount of money, you get a lot more of everything in something like a Xiaomi. And I did enough research into it to decide that, yeah, these people were telling the truth. And I decided to pick up one of these Xiaomi phones. And by that point, I'd also decided to try out a smaller screen. I like the big screen phones, but everyone around me was so excited about smaller phones. Every time they saw my phone, they would say, "Oh man, your phone is way too big. Why do you carry that huge thing around with you? Why don't you get a nice small phone? Look at my little iPhone, it fits in my shirt pocket." And I guess they convinced me, so I went for a smaller phone this time. And I have to say, I kind of enjoyed it for a while, but I always missed the big screen of my Motorola. I always go for my Motorola first, just because I like that much bigger screen. So it's a very nice phone, the Xiaomi. I don't really have any complaints about it. But the issue with it is similar to with the Motorola. It's worse in a way. It has double the memory. It has 32 gigabytes of storage, but it's also full. And it shouldn't be. I mean, I run exactly the same programs on this phone as I do on the Motorola. On the Motorola, I'm nudging against 16 gigabytes. On this one, same programs, same apps, same everything, and suddenly it's using up 32 gigabytes of memory. So I'm running into memory limitations on this phone as well, and I don't really know why. So that is the story of my old phones and basically why I would like to upgrade. The story of my new phone is probably equally as complicated. Of course, I don't have it yet. I'm still doing the research and I'm shopping. And I'm looking for a mid-range phone in around $200 to maybe $300 US at the most. It doesn't make a lot of sense for me to spend more than that. And in my research, I've been learning a lot about all kinds of things. And I know a lot about the various options that are out there from Samsung, from Xiaomi, from Motorola, from all the big companies. And one interesting thing that I've kind of learned over time is that, like, when it comes to a phone like the Xiaomi, each individual feature could be amazing. So for example, I'm looking seriously at the Galaxy A31, but a lot of people will say, no, don't buy that. You know, Samsungs are overpriced, and they'll point to some other phone that has a more powerful processor. So for example, there's the Xiaomi Note 9 Pro, and they say, well, don't buy a Galaxy A31 or Galaxy M31. Spend the same amount of money, and you can get the Xiaomi Note 9 Pro, and it has more of everything. It has a more powerful processor, more memory, more Gorilla Glass instead of this. And that is all true. But in my experience, there's a little magic sauce that goes into it. This phone may have all of these individual components that one by one look better, but the key to any electronics now is how those devices work together. There's a lot in how these things are put together. And it seems like how you blend your processor with the GPU, with the battery, with the screen, how all of those units are balanced and work together can make a huge difference in terms of how the phone functions. So one phone may have a much more powerful processor, but then when you go to use it to play a game or process a video or do anything, it actually doesn't work as well as the other phone that has a weaker processor. And that's because the other phone is just more sophisticated. It's more mature the way it's put together. Plus, there is the question of the operating system. All these phones operate on Android, but then they put their own skin on top of Android. So Samsung, of course, has their own operating system on top of Android, and Xiaomi has theirs, which they call, I think, MIUI, something like that. And you may not like MIUI. It may not have the features that Samsung has. Again, one of the reasons I leaned towards Motorola back in the day was that it was closest to a pure experience of Android. And everybody thought that was amazing, that you get almost pure Android as your interface. Whereas Samsung phones had all kinds of bells and whistles that Samsung put on top of Android. And I thought it was kind of cool to get the clean Motorola experience. But in the end, I found I missed all the little touches that Samsung puts on their phones. So yeah, so you have to consider the operating system on top of Android as well when you're looking at phones. Anyway, after all of that babbling, I'm here at a smartphone store, finally, and I'm just going to go inside and take a look around. And I'll report back what I find, what I conclude, what I discover. Well, I didn't learn a whole lot when I was in there. It's one of those typical stores where the clerks are really there just to take the money and ring you up at the cash register. They don't know anything about the phones. They're not interested in technology, so you can't. And of course, no one spoke any English, so I couldn't talk with them about the phones anyway. But I got to see all the different options in front of me and kind of got reminded of some of the other brands that, for whatever reason, I never even consider because they're so unfamiliar to me, like Oppo, for example, the Oppo brand. Very good phones, as good as anything else on the market, and very popular here in Southeast Asia. But they're not so well known, I don't think, in the West, and it's just not a brand I end up considering. And they had quite a range of Xiaomi products, which again are not that well known in the West. And there's a new Chinese company which is making some waves, making some headlines, called Realme. And they had a whole bunch of Realme phones there. And I think the advantage to them is similar to Xiaomi in that they're cheaper and you get a lot more bang for your buck when you buy one of those phones. The other thing I learned, I guess, is just what these phones look like in person. The weird thing about all these new Samsungs, they look strange to me because they're so tall. They all have 6.4-inch screens, so they're much higher, but they really haven't gotten any wider. So when you look at them, they look really weird. They look tall and skinny, and they give the impression that the screen isn't very wide. But it's kind of an illusion because I took out my Motorola, which has what I think of as a very wide screen, put it next to this Galaxy A31, and they're exactly the same width. They're the same width, but because the Galaxy is now taller, it makes it look like it's narrower when really it isn't. So you just kind of have to get used to that new form factor. And the form factor doesn't really mean anything to me. I think they did it that way because people like to use their phones one-handed. They hold the phone with one hand and then swipe and do all the buttons with their thumb. So they need the phone to be narrow to do that. You could easily go the other way for me, make it as wide and fat as you want. Because I don't do one-handed operation, I always do two-handed. Half the time these days, my phones are sitting inside a tripod on my desk, like since I'm using it like a computer. So it doesn't really matter to me how wide or fat it is. I'd prefer it if it was wider. And going into these shops in person is interesting too, because I find I'm always looking for that store where I feel welcome, where I feel comfortable. And if I walk into, in my mind, I'm thinking that I'd rather go to a big store, a big box store where it's more impersonal and they have a bigger selection and everything feels formal and organized. So I would rather go to Power Buy instead of one of these small shops on the street. But if I went into one of these small shops and I was greeted in a very friendly way, a warm welcome, and they made me feel welcome, then I would feel good about that place, and I would probably go back there when I make my decision to buy the phone. But most of the time around here, at least in Mae Sot in general, when I go into the smaller shops, I don't get that welcome. I don't get that sense of, a friendly smile. They're friendly people and helpful, but it does not come out naturally when I, as a foreigner, walk into the store. They kind of like, foreigner, what do we do? So I will probably end up going to a Power Buy or someplace like that, where I'm more sure of my ground. That's the end of my technology thoughts for today. As I said, I didn't intend to go off on such long tangents. I thought I'd be spending a lot more time inside the smartphone shops or in the cell phone shops, but there's really not much in there that I can do. I can't really talk to anybody, and I can't try out any of the phones. These are places where you just go in and buy one and leave. There isn't a whole lot of interaction possible at these places, so I popped into a few shops, and that's the end of it. Back on the internet to do more research.
I don't pay with them in the morning.
You paid them in the morning?
No, I don't pay. So I say, wait, afternoon.
Oh, okay.
So this is your second time be here.
Jadi papat.
It's good? It's good? So this might be an interesting morning. I'm heading off to meet Teresa for breakfast. And then we're going to the main police station to meet the police chief and his wife for some kind of ceremony or celebration leading up to Indonesian Independence Day. See what happens.